Hello, welcome to Being Reintegrated. This is Tim Wright. What I'm doing is I'm trying to talk with everyone about what's being created. I said that I would have some Saint Martin material available. So that's exactly what I'm working on. A couple of volumes. One is called, Saint Martin, his ministry and theurgy. But I'm doing also another piece of material called the CoenCommentaries. And what these are commentaries on the lessons of Lyons. I'll just read you the introduction. I plan to release these on Kindle and OmniShelf. So I'm not sure if they're going to be physical books due to their length. I don't know where that should go unless people want to purchase, large books, because my notes for the Lyons Lessons are over 1,000 pages. So we're getting a pretty comprehensive and refined view of exactly what this is. So it has become necessary to expand the lessons of Lyons curated by my late friend Paul Edward Rana and presented in the OMS edition translated by another friend, Alex Bushman. Setting aside my own work of synthesis and rereading of Saint Martin, we now have scholars who study the lessons from both theurgical and doctrinal perspectives. And when we take the full scope of the material, we gain an enormous amount of insight into the content. Paired with Saint Martin's doctrinal exposition, Man, His Nature and Ministry, we now stand very close to forming a complete and coherent exposition of the lessons of Lyons. Kim Publishing has spent years gathering manuscript fragments to construct this doctrinal presentation, and the process has not been simple. Challenging the prevailing narrative never is. And it was not easy for Antoine Favois either when he produced his own synthesis and his commentary on the lessons, a commentary he approached with the utmost rigor. Anyone familiar with French scholarship on this 18th century movement of the Coen has encountered Le Forester, Rigenberg, and Joly in their original French work, and these constitute the primary scholarly points of reference we have now informed this entire conversation. To this earlier foundation, we can now add the work of Favois, Lefebvre, George Courts, and Gerard Guindet, which together form the essential resources that any English-speaking illuminist must understand in order to navigate this tradition responsibly. It is not easy to speak about the lessons of Lyons because they represent the mature and interior doctrine of the Coens. One must understand the degree structure, the symbolic corpus, and the secondary developments that surround the materials, or else the lessons remain opaque. The starting point is Saint Martin's own instruction on reforming the mind so that human consciousness becomes capable of receiving impressions from what the tradition calls beings, whose influence directs thought toward an ontological mode of understanding. In Errors in Truth, he confronted the leading educational voices of the Enlightenment by scrutinizing the epistemic foundations upon which they built their systems. His critique was not welcomed, and many found it presumptuous, yet he insisted that their premises operated within the mind of the fall rather than within the mind of reintegration. Because epistemically and ontologically they were still rooted in the rupture from the divine principle. In Man, His Nature and Ministry, he makes this rupture explicit from the first pages. Human intelligence, he says, fixes itself on external things and cannot even understand those externals adequately. In doing so, it blinds itself to the nature of its own being, and since man is the primary witness and mirror of the divine source, once he ceases to regard his own essence, the divine disappears from his understanding. For this reason, Saint-Martin declares that proofs of God drawn from external nature are cold, dry, humiliating, and can generate atheism more readily than faith, whereas proofs taken from man's inner essence are warm, dignifying, and harmonious. If external nature could have revealed the divine adequately, God would have never had to need to create man. Man himself is the necessary witness. Part of this insight came from the exposure to the teachings of the strict observance, a Kabbalistic movement that held that the doctrines of initiatic societies had to be recast in the light of spiritual entities and forces. This was not received well by groups that wished to move with the prevailing intellectual currents of the Enlightenment, and the tensions fractured the original German movements, especially when competing thinkers attempted to construct rival systems of masonry based on Egypt or alternative mythologies of origin. Members of the strict observance defended the Templar origin myth, and this narrative migrated through various bodies as they sought both antiquity and relevance amidst the expanding esoteric landscape of the 18th century. As these groups competed for members, they also struggled to maintain the integrity of their doctrines, and it was within this confusion that the Coen arose. Martinez de Pasquale believed that many contemporary Masons no longer practiced the true craft, and therefore set out to establish the order of the Coen. Saint-Martin entered this world in his mid-20s, and it is highly likely that he wrestled with the need to reform for many years. Later in the century, he began writing, and with his Man in His Nature and Ministry, the essential doctrine of the Illuminist tradition was released in full clarity. This doctrine stood apart from its contemporaries. It did not revere intellect in the usual way. It claimed that the very categories of knowledge used by the culture were deformed by the fallen mind. If thinkers understood the modality of communion, they would distinguish far more precisely between modes of thought. At its deepest level, this distinction is what the Coens call operation. One begins with first principles, applies number-based logic to the epistemic mind, and then brings this mind into relation with the hypostatic beings of the tradition, not by historical or linguistic analysis, but by allowing the being to communicate its knowledge directly, measured, and ordered according to number, and transmitted into the suffering mind engaged in the work of reintegration. Saint-Martin rejects the whole project of natural theology in favor of this ontological approach. He criticizes his contemporaries and the entire catalog of external proofs, insisting that they can demonstrate at most the divine power, which is the least revealing attribute, and that they never reach wisdom or love. The atheistic retreat into this eternity of matter and movement is, for him, the natural child of this failed epistemology. Only a reformed mind, turned toward its own essence and toward the beings that address it, can receive the divine testimony. Another dimension is necessary for understanding Saint-Martin's rupture with the dominant French educational current, because his transformation parallels on the psychic and symbolic plane what Marie-Louise von Fontes identified in her analysis of Apuleius in The Golden Ass. She observed that Apuleius dramatizes the process of psychic deconstruction under the weight of spiritual forces, a process in which the protagonist is stripped of inherited identities and social veneers in order to discover a deeper mode of being. Saint-Martin undergoes a similar interior process, not in mythic narrative form, but in the lived psychological and spiritual reality of a French aristocrat caught in the Revolution. The aristocratic formation that shaped his youth gave him a complete cultural identity, including the traditional sense of social stability and the assumption of a worldly place. Yet this very foundation was hollowed out in him. social collapse during the Revolution, and his personal turn toward poverty, both voluntary and enforced, strip away the French aristocratic mental habits that ordinarily allow a person to remain insulated within the external order. And Maupertuis, in the second volume of the Watkins manuscript reconstruction published by Kim Publishing, up there, we see him confronting the full collapse of worldly assurances and the interior vacuum that follows such a collapse. He describes the state of desire, ambition, and personal frustration, and he describes the sensation of being pulled apart between inherited habits of identity and the call of an entirely different mode of existence. This psychological tension is not incidental to his philosophy. It is the experiential ground from which his doctrinal insights arose. In Man, His Nature and Ministry, Saint-Martin teaches that man carries a spiritual essence that has been eclipsed, as well as a false built self upon external impressions, social expectations, and the illusions of the sensible world. When the false self is eroded, the true essence begins to appear. He writes that man becomes blind to his eternal source when he ceases to fix his gaze on the interior mirror that reflects it. His own life demonstrates this process. He was placed in conditions where the outward mirror of aristocratic identity shattered, and this forced him to confront his own nature in the interior sense described in his metaphysical works. His insistence that man must verify the primary truths within himself before consulting books reflects a personal path in which external supports had already dissolved. His claim that man is degraded yet still carries the imprint of divine rights echoes the tension he felt between his fallen social condition and the latent spiritual calling that he believed still resided within the human essence. His descriptions of the soul's sensitivity, the feeling of its own privation, and the need to reestablish a conjunction between spirit and heart are not abstract metaphysical positions. They are psychological facts witnessed in his own disintegration of inherited identity and his movement toward an ontological restoration of essence. The same pages of Ministry show that man's constant resistance, his struggle with opposing forces, and his intuition of immortality are both proofs of his fall and his greatness, and they introduce the two eternities whose mixture produces time. Nature, he says, is the veil that hides both the true and the false eternal, and therefore can never reveal the complete God. This illuminates the deep connection between Saint-Martin's intellectual posture and the emerging German idealism of his time, as well as the older ceremonial psychologies of medieval spiritual guides. He lives physically in France, but his interior disposition is closer to German thinkers who identified the absolute with the activity of consciousness, and to the medieval mystics who understood spiritual beings not as symbols, but as operative presences that shape thought and destiny. For Saint-Martin, cognition, morality, and ontology belong to a single movement of reintegration. When social identity is stripped away, the soul begins its work. When intellectual categories collapse, the essence begins to speak. When material ambition becomes impossible, spiritual ambition awakens. This is the psychological foundation beneath his metaphysics, and it explains why he sees ambition for worldly success as a distortion of a deeper longing for truth. It explains why he interprets the dissonance of the social world as a symptom of the spiritual dissonance of fallen man. It also explains why he speaks constantly of a double consciousness within the human being, one shaped by nature and society, and the other shaped by the reminiscence of its divine origin. The collapse of his aristocratic world did not simply change his economic status. It exposed the gap between temporal identity and eternal essence, and this tension became the seed of his entire philosophy. For this reason, the Lessons of Lyons, the Coen Doctrine, and his three major works must be read not only as metaphysical treatises, but as intellectual crystallization of a profound psychic ordeal. Samartin's life displays a pattern in which each phase expresses excellence, born not from understanding that produces comfort, but from discomfort that forces the psychic dimension of his existence to remain fully present and uncompromised. His simplicity of life, often described as the restored Mont Portrait, aligns with the influence of figures such as Abbe Fournier and with the general tenor of the Coen-Milu. The translator for Kim Publishing notes in Watkins' manuscript volume 3 that he consistently avoids emotional and material progress, choosing instead conditions that return him to what he calls the simplicity and obscurity of the life he should always have led. This matches his insistence that providence must guide him rather than the cultural expectations of his aristocratic class. He did not want to become a teacher within the educational structure he rejected. He wanted to redefine its axis by becoming more simple and by adopting what the Coens call the one-will attitude, the posture that whatever happens is meant to happen, and that ambition or active modification of circumstance only distorts the work. In the Coen tradition, this is the lesson of the ark and of Noah's obedience, the willingness to let events unfold according to higher intention. Viewed through this psychology of the blue band, his book on Numbers shows why this posture is central, because it describes the impossibility of sustaining a second center within the individual and the collapse that follows any attempt to divide the will. The fall associated with the second degree is not an intellectual teaching. It manifests in the body as disruption when knowledge reaches its highest rung without corresponding transformation. The final pedagogical degree taught by Martinez is the degree of Noah, the submission of personal will to the divine directive, expressed in the building and apparent aimlessness of the ark. This degree does not signify passivity. It marks the threshold through which one gains the capacity to engage the next series of psycho-spiritual modalities, which function as a kind of psychic apparatus similar to scuba equipment, allowing the initiate to explore interior worlds that coexist with the conventional worlds of ambition and career. According to Monlevy-Vert, Samartin presents a psychology of spiritual life in which simplicity, dispossession, and surrender to providence are essential conditions for restoration. The text rejects ambition, progress, and comfort as reliable aims. It celebrates adversity as a divine sign and elevates suffering as the true offering a person brings to God, since those in misfortune gave him their necessities rather than their surplus. The work frames human life as a continual return to divine order, shown in its teaching that the universal object of the great mover is perpetual restoration in every domain of existence, including ignorance, health, the seasons, and even the cosmic events of expulsion and the flood. This theme aligns with the Coen teaching that views Noah's submission to divine will as a psychological state rather than a historical obedience. Monlevy-Vert reinforces this inner model by insisting that man could do nothing by himself and that everything comes to him from above, so that his entire task is simply to avoid obstructing the good that wishes to act through him. The book warns against the formation of false centers, explaining how the misalignment of faculties corrupts body, soul, and spirit, which echoes the impossibility of generating a second center of will. It concludes that the highest science is metaphysics, the only science offering fixed and universal principles, which parallels the psycho-spiritual modalities that allow the human being to inhabit simultaneous inner worlds. In all of these observations, Monlevy-Vert affirms a worldview in which simplicity, obedience to providential movement, restoration through trial, and refusal of worldly ambition are not moral preferences, but ontological necessities. To understand the lessons of Lyons in their true depth, the reader must learn to see Samartin's doctrine through the three distinct axes that operate simultaneously. Each acts like a magnification lens. One reads with only, or if one reads only with a single lens, or even two, the lessons appear partial or obscure. When all three are held together, they form a complete field of vision that reveals the inner structure of the work. The first axis is doctrinal. It is the philosophical body of teaching that Saint-Martin developed across Errors and Truth, Man, His Nature and Ministry, and other books, and his metaphysical fragments. This axis explains the architecture of being, the principle of reintegration, and the precise distinctions he makes between essence, faculties, will, and the modes of thought. Without this doctrinal axis, the symbolic content of the Lyons Lessons collapses into allegory or moral instruction rather than an operative science. The second axis is theurgical. The Lyons Lessons cannot be understood if they are detached from the operative world of the Elu Kohen. Martinez de Pasquale insisted that the restoration of man required communication with the hypostatic beings that govern the reintegration of the worlds. Saint-Martin modifies the practice, but he does not remove its ontological foundation. The lessons remain unintelligible unless the reader recognizes that the figures described in the text are not literary symbols, but active intelligences whose influence forms the basis of operation. This axis explains why Saint-Martin can speak of prayer, number, and symbolic impressions as vehicles for actual transmission. The third axis is psychological. It is the most easily missed and the most essential. Saint-Martin wrote the Lyons material during a period when his own identity, social world, and intellectual foundations were collapsing. This is why the lessons reflect the inner states associated with dispossession, simplicity, and the dissolution of false centers. The psychological axis shows how the doctrine must be lived in the tensions between degradation and divine imprint, memory of origin and the weight of the fall, inherited identity and interior birth. Without this axis, the doctrinal and theurgical systems remain abstract and cannot be integrated into consciousness. Only when the reader uses all three lenses together does the real meaning of the Lyons Lessons come into focus. The doctrinal axis provides the structure, the theurgical axis provides the method, the psychological axis provides the experiential ground in which the method becomes real. When these three converge, the reader sees the lessons as Saint-Martin intended them, not as scattered notes from an initiatic school, but as the crystallization of a unified science of reintegration that advances through number, through being, and through the suffering and transformation of the interior man. Thanks for coming by and checking this out.